Welcome to New Economic Thinking. I'm here this morning with Chris Benner, who is a professor of environmental studies and sociology at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I've been reading some of your recent books. You just have two very interesting books out, Just Growth and Equity, Community, and Growth. Maybe Equity, Growth, and Community.
Growth, and Community. But they all go together.
And actually the two books go together very interestingly because you're looking at the structure of employment, the changing structure of employment in America and the world, and linking it with economic growth. And one of the messages that comes out from these books is that more equitable societies tend to grow better, which is obviously great news for liberals and conservatives. And I'd love to know how tight you think this causal link is.
Part of the way we think about it is that you can have either a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle. And we're looking particularly at metropolitan regions, metropolitan economies. And there's a number of reasons why a metropolitan scale is a really important way for understanding economic activity and economic structures and the factors that create growth and opportunity. But we find some regions in the U.S. where equity and growth have gone together over the last 20 to 30 years, and they seem to reinforce each other in really important ways. And other regions, you can imagine places like Detroit or Gary or many of the Rust Belt cities where inequality has increased, and it helps lead to increasing disinvestment and fleeing of investment and capital. And so you get this vicious cycle of growing inequality and slower growth in other places across the country. But what the books have really been trying to do is not look so much at that correlation between equity and growth, but really try and understand how and why is it that regions that have been successful in linking equity and growth over the last 30 years of tremendous economic restructuring in this country, how and why have they been able to do that? So that's what we're really focusing on in those books.
And you find some very interesting case studies that look at some of the different ways in which cities have made this happen. And you talk about knowledge as being a really important part of this, and then sometimes even tensions within the community and how those serve to bring together the community. You describe different public-private partnerships. So for example, in the case of Sacramento, you talk about how the government was very important. In the case of Salt Lake City, it really was business and the private sector that took more of a role. Can you tell us a little bit about how we can start thinking about these different examples in terms of developing policy and how we might be able to encourage some of these developments?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that part of our methodology in this book, which was really critical leading to that, was really letting the data and the numbers drive the case studies that we're looking at. Because often in the field of urban economics, people go to places like Portland with its regional structure or Minneapolis-St. Paul with its regional tax-bearing system, and you're essentially letting the dependent variable drive where you select regions to look at. And we wanted to step back and look at, well, where actually are those regions where equity and growth have come together? And so what emerges is some very unusual places that haven't been studied so much, and unexpected ones. And as you say, it really doesn't come out on a liberal versus conservative spectrum. We have places like Oklahoma City, one of the more conservative states and regions in the country, that was really able to turn around its economic fortunes from the 80s, where it was a very difficult portion of both growth and growing inequality, towards the 90s and 2000s. And the way they did it, surprisingly, in a conservative state and city, was through increased taxes that was invested in essentially major public sector investment programs. And the majority of voters in the region voted for increased taxes, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the last 20 years. And why did that happen in such a place? Well, part of what enabled it to happen was a recognition that they had to build on their own internal resources. Prior to that, it had been a very typical economic development strategy for the region of trying to attract outside investment. And they had a very high-profile effort to get a United Airlines maintenance facility to locate at the Oklahoma City airport. And they lost out in the bidding war to Indianapolis. And so they realized, well, if we're willing to provide tax subsidies to someone else coming in, well, why don't we tax ourselves to promote our own economic development? And so they put on the ballot a temporary sales tax. But what was critical was they wasn't for a single initiative. It was for 9 different projects. And it was everything from the basketball arena that became the home of the Oklahoma City Thunder. It was the improvements to the county fairgrounds. It was improving recreational activities along what's now known as the Oklahoma City River. It was some improved transportation initiatives downtown. But what was critical in trying to get that tax passed was appealing to the variety of interests in the region. So you may not be interested in minor league baseball, but you might be interested in the symphony hall. So are you going to give up your symphony just because you don't like minor league baseball? And so it forced people to recognize the diversity of interests in the region and come together in sharing that knowledge to then pass this increased taxes, which has then completely transformed the downtown area and helped turn around the economy of Oklahoma City. So that's one example. You mentioned Salt Lake City, and this is a case where government actually had very little involvement in it. There, the 2 key institutions that we think were important were the Mormon Church, which has a very strong social welfare system, but the particular structure of the clergy in the Mormon Church is it's a lay clergy system, and so the local bishops are there for 3 to 6 years or so, and they're typically prominent business leaders or local leaders. They're all men. But one of the things that they do is are responsible for the Provident Fund to support disadvantaged people in the area that they serve, not just Mormons, so it goes beyond the Mormon Church as well. So where else in the country do we have a systematic process where our major business leaders and public leaders have experience for 6 years or so as social workers, because it's a very active social work system. They also have a very strong sort of international work abroad process as part of the Mormon Church, and so you have large numbers of people who have experience speaking Spanish, and so they have been remarkably welcome and opening to immigrants. Kind of surprising for the conservative state. But the other key institution in Salt Lake City is an organization called Envision Utah. Small nonprofit organization that started origins in the early 80s, but really taken off in the 90s, to look at long-term visioning for the region. What do we want to look like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, the legacy we're leaving to our children? And an integrated plan of looking at environment, housing, transportation, the economy, all the factors that we want to concern about, and in a very participatory approach. I mean, literally in their most recent effort, they had more than 50,000 people voting online and others in in-person systems about different scenarios about how we might develop. And coming to this recognition that we really need our metropolitan area, in this case, to grow more densely, so we're not eating up the farmland and the green land on the periphery, that we want greater investment in transportation systems. And so Salt Lake City now has one of the best mass transit systems in the country as measured by access from home to work. It has some environmental problems with the air quality, but they're working on improving that. So that was another critical factor of bringing together these diverse constituencies. And it comes back to the key point you started with, that what we found in these books and the research we did, which surprised us, was that knowledge matters. And we talk about a term we called epistemic communities, knowledge communities, and arguing that those regions that have been successful have had particularly diverse and dynamic epistemic communities, knowledge communities that bring together these diverse constituencies over time. And what that allows a region to do is to identify greater opportunities for new markets. It leads to greater innovation processes, which, as we know, is a real core of economic growth in today's economy. And more critically, it allows the diversity of institutions in the region. The community colleges, the universities, the workforce development programs, the businesses, the different clusters of businesses, which are very important for competition, to be able to be more coordinated in their activity and response to the changing economic circumstances that they face. I don't think there's one solution, and I think anyone who says, oh yeah, this is the key that's going to solve the problem, is probably presenting too simplistic a story. I think the good news, though, is that we found in the successful regions around the country a whole range of different institutions that played key roles in convening diverse actors together and building long-term conversations. And I guess I would say a couple of key principles that we saw emerging in that. One is a commitment to facts rather than ideology. We all come to our work in the world with certain preconceived notions, but when we're rooted in those preconceived notions to the exclusion of listening and understanding, hearing, and being willing to be persuaded by fact, then we're really missing important opportunities. The second thing I would say is that this is not about holding hands and singing Kumbaya and really collaborating in this easy way. It's about very real conflict. We have different conflicting values and conflicting priorities and different constituencies. The trick is, how do you engage in long-term conversation with what we call principled conflict? And that's a conflict in which we're being honest and open with each other about differences, but with a commitment to maintaining a long-term relationship and a recognition that we all have a long-term future in the region together. So it's a common destiny.
So if I start thinking about long-term solutions and some of the facts that we're looking at now, another one of the areas that you've looked at is how the nature of work has been changing. And this touches, of course, on technology, and it also touches on a changing political economy. And one of the things that you have talked about and others have talked about is how this recovery, the recovery from our last very serious deep recession, does not look the same as previous recoveries, that we're looking at what some are referring to as a jobless recovery. And I think it does tie in with this notion of how we think about the nature of work, how we think about an inclusive community, how we involve people in the growth process. And there is a question as to whether we're seeing something change at a very structural level, which makes it more challenging to build the kinds of communities that you're talking about, where we actually include everyone in this process. One of the things that we've noticed is that if you look at productivity growth since the 1970s, and you compare that to growth of median income, for example, we're starting to see a big divergence. And while we can work towards more equitable growth, if there are more structural changes in the nature of work, in the nature of what we produce, are there ways we can approach this in terms of rethinking employment and jobs in general that can address this issue of our jobless recovery and the changing nature of employment in our country?
Yeah. So I would say several things about that. It's a very important set of issues. One is that the kind of structural changes that you're describing are not emerging just from the most recent recession. In fact, if you go back for the last three recoveries, this is back to the early 90s, the recovery from the dot-bomb crash in the 2000s, and the most recent one, all three of them had experiences of 2 to 4 years of essentially jobless growth, despite growth taking off, jobs not being created. And that's in very stark contrast to every recovery from World War II up until that point. And you can imagine there's lots of factors going on in the restructuring from the early 90s on, including the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of the Soviet Union and China and India to a global economy, and of course the Internet, World Wide Web really accelerating its diffusion throughout the economy. So they're long-term trends, and it's really the period we've been looking at in these books of that restructuring from essentially an industrial economy to an informational economy. But one of the critical things I think we have to recognize in our new economy is that the sources of growth, the sources of innovation, the sources of the things that drive our economy are not happening in a single workplace. They're happening through broadly distributed communicative processes, through links between companies and their consumers, through all the ways that our activities on our social media and Google searches add value to the companies that use them, Google, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, to the kinds of innovation and communication sharing that happen between universities and businesses, between community colleges. It even has to do with the kinds of aspirations that our young people have and the information and knowledge that they have about what are promising careers and skills to achieve. So growth is collective. And yet we have a system of very individualized compensation and employment. And I would mention one other thing about jobs. I mean, our median length of time in a job in the U.S. at the moment is about 4.5 years. Now, obviously, some people have much longer time in a single job, but we should be planning for and building systems that assume people are going to be in a job for a relatively short period of time. And we need to be thinking about how do they move to different jobs? How do they improve their skills in the current job? How do we have that sort of system of inter-firm and inter-job mobility in a realistic way? And I think part of what that suggests is that we need broader systems of what's often called a social wage. So these are the commitments to free education at a higher level. I think that's something we should really be thinking about in higher education. It means better subsidies for transportation, better subsidies for housing. People from across a political spectrum, from libertarian to progressive, are even now talking about the potential for a basic income grant, some kind of universal guaranteed income to provide some level of basic living circumstances that would facilitate the transition from job to job to job over a lifetime, because that's really what the future looks like. But it does require us to rethink what we mean by compensation for work in society. And if we have a collective process of building knowledge, much of it, by the way, driven by public sector investment. I mean, we know, of course, the public's investment in the internet and the creation of the internet, but even the glass on the iPhone screen comes out of investments from the Defense Department in kind of military grade glass to protect it. And so in many different fields, you can see the importance of public investment in creating growth. And so I think there's an argument to be made that the public at large should be seeing some returns from that. And that the levels of returns we're seeing amongst, a few small companies and the high-paid employees within those is an example of them capturing essentially economic rents from intellectual capital that was developed through a much broader social process.
This actually, I think, touches on some very deep issues as we look ahead to our future and where our country is going to go and really where the world is going to go as we start to think about how we structure our social contract, more than just employment, our general social contract. And this has been very, very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
It's been a real pleasure talking with you. Thank you.